there are those perceived conflicts that are just going to be there, and we have to understand that. Would you agree with that, Paul?
Yeah, I think so, Tim. I mean, you talk about an inherent conflict, and I think there's some of that goes along with that. That's part of the reason why I enjoyed being an umpire, is because I'm equally as far away from both coaches, and I can act like I'm a little bit deaf when I'm out there. So there's a certain advantage to that. But the coaches out there are, they have a goal. I mean, they're trying to win a game. They spend a lot of time on their teams. I mean, in addition to generally a full-time teaching position, at least here in Illinois, these guys are full-time teachers, whether it's phys ed or math or physics or whatever it is they teach. I mean, they spend a lot of time outside of their normal teaching day doing sports, and that's at the expense of their family, their children, and a lot of other people. So, I mean, this is a big burden that they take on to actually coach and, do this in what really amounts to being their spare time and their off hours. I mean, they do get a bit of a stipend to do that, but, let's face it, these guys spend, a lot of time almost volunteering to do this. And so they come out there with a lot of, a lot of intensity. They want to win. A lot of them are former players themselves, and, they direct a lot of energy to this. And I think sometimes, they're looking for the same sort of level of commitment from us. And I think if there's a perceived, notion that we aren't as invested as they are, I think that's where a lot of conflict can come in that they don't actually, see our level of commitment. If they think we don't hustle, if they think our rules knowledge is incomplete, if we're hesitating a lot, that seems to think that, hey, this guy's not as committed or, as invested as I am in this whole game.
And by the way, please feel free that we do have some comments. I've been mentioning them already in the chat room. You can also call in our studio line, 646-652-2962. If you do have a comment, want to join in on the discussion, email as well. Any comments, you may have comments at officiallyspeaking.com. And so, yeah, I do agree with that. Obviously the time commitment that's there, and there's the perception that, they're getting hosed, for lack of a better term. So, now that we've established that there's that inherent conflict, it's there, we know it's there, and it is, and for the reasons that Paul mentioned and I mentioned. So how do we deal with that conflict? Obviously, when things enter into that unsporting-like manner, we have tools at our disposal, but how do we deal with it on the borderline? How do we bring them back to a level that we're not going to cross into that unsportsmanlike arena, for lack of a better explanation of it? Now, one of the things is be a good listener. As an official, you have to be a good listener. You have to not think, even if you're right and you are right and you're supported by film or whatever, you got the call and you're 100% correct on it, you still sometimes have to listen to the voice of dissent. You have to listen. I didn't say you have to do anything, you have to act upon it, but you have to listen to the voice of dissent, because sometimes that's all they want to do. All coaches want to do sometimes is be heard. And if they do it in a respectful manner, and maybe sometimes it's not as respectful as you would like, but they don't cross any lines, then you just listen to them. Just listen to what they have to say and say, Coach, I hear what you have to say. You always hear the line agree to disagree. I mean, sometimes you don't even have to get that far. Sometimes they already know you're right, but they still want to let you know that they think you're wrong, even though they know you're right, because it's posturing. I need to make sure that this guy doesn't think that I'm not paying attention to the game. I want to make sure that this guy knows that I'm going to be on him if he screws up, whether he gets it right or wrong. Now, is that right or wrong in a whole? Should a coach just be quiet and understand that we're doing the best job? Sure, that's a perfect world, but we don't live in a perfect world, and so sometimes these guys do play us. I mean, would you agree with that, Paul? And what steps do you normally take when you find yourself right walking that line to try to bring a guy back down, bring him back into that acceptable level?
Well, I think you're right, Tim. You identified several things that are going on. Because, honestly, this rules beef, I mean, part of it goes back, one of my first real job that I had when I graduated college, I went to work for a very small software company, and, being a nice green college graduate, what did I get assigned to do but answer the telephone and do tech support? Now, if any of you out there has ever, had the pleasure of doing a job like that, you know how difficult it is. Because one of the things that you had to really own in on when people called is they want something. they generally just aren't calling for their health or just because they're lonely. I mean, they want something, and I think that's part of what you need to figure out with the coach when you're listening. And when you're talking about being a good listener, I think that's key too. What do they want? The coaches want something. What is it they want? Do they, do they want you to make a different ruling because I think you screwed up the rule? Okay, well, hopefully as a referee, you know the rules better than the coaches do. So, listen to what he thinks the rule interpretation is, explain it to him, and, see if you can do it a couple of different ways, and eventually you just might have to disagree and move on. Some of it is what you talked about is posturing. Sometimes there's just I don't like the way this is going, or the game is going, or the way my team is playing, and the guy thinks he can get some sort of edge on you by working on you, that at some point maybe he can get the right influence on you to decide something his way if he keeps at you. I think there's a lot of that goes on there, and unfortunately I think most of it is ill spent. The longer we're in the game, the less we, the longer we're officials, I think the less we begin to listen to that and process that. Also sometimes just listening and finding out the coach is just mad. Enough things have just not gone his way, or enough guys have dropped passes or made mistakes, and that maybe some beefy or perceived beef he has with their officiating has just pushed him over the edge. Maybe he's mad. He wants to vent, and that's what he wants to do. He wants to vent, and sometimes you have to let him do a little bit of that. But again, sometimes it's like coming down there and just trying to figure out really what does the guy want. I mean, he wants something from you. And part of it is if you can ascertain what that is, I think you're in a much better position to actually, figure out where to go from there and how to bring him back to being reasonable. Some guys just may not be reasonable. And sometimes he's not looking for a discussion. He's just looking to, yammer at someone, and that might just happen to be you. So it might not be something you have to take personally, but when he's right in your ear, it is kind of hard to ignore, especially if you're working on the wings.
Well, yeah, and that's definitely the case, and obviously you're, like you said, you're only going to let it go to a certain extent, but understand what he wants, like what they want as a coach. That makes a lot of sense, because if you can figure that out, if they just want to vent and you don't respond, a lot of times coaches don't want to be ignored either. A lot of times we've taken the approach as officials just to kind of ignore it, just kind of not even acknowledge it. Well, sometimes that doesn't work either. It actually becomes counterproductive, because now the coach thinks he's being ignored, and he's going to get louder and get more abusive and stuff like that. Sometimes just okay, coach, I hear you. Yeah, okay, I hear you, and that's it. As long as you just acknowledge that you heard him, whether or not you're going to respond, like you said, Paul, maybe he just wants to vent at you. Whether or not you're going to respond or not, that's fine. But I hear you. That sometimes just does enough, and the guy will walk away, because all he wants to do is be heard, and if he knows you heard you, that might be the end of it.
Yeah, I think that's key too. I mean, you need to be able to, it's like that poor commercial where the referee is,
right,
sitting at the sideline just getting yelled at by the guy. They say, "How does the referee practice for this?" And it turns out he's at home. His wife is yelling at him constantly. I mean, you don't want to be that desensitized, but this reminds me of watching an NFL game within the last couple of years, and the great referee Bill Carollo was there was some unusual situation that happened in the game. So Bill ends up on the sideline with a couple of his guys in tow, and the coach is really ranting about something. And finally, you could sort of see Bill's lips ask the coach, "What would you like us to do?" And the coach then laid out what he wanted them to do, and after the officials talked about it, they ended up agreeing with the coach, because it was kind of an unusual situation. I wish I could remember more details about it, but it was one of the best pieces of officiating I've seen in a long time. He just came up and said, "What would you like us to do?" And it invited the coach to participate rather than have it be one-sided. Well, granted, that's not going to be appropriate for every situation, but, that was a case where it enlisted the coach's help, and he felt like he was invested in the process.
No,